Hey guys, and welcome back. So, we're going to continue working through the immune system, right? And today we're talking about an herb that we've already talked about, but we're going to go into a deeper dive with it, especially around the immune system, right? And that's our friend Echinacea. Because somewhere along the way, Echinacea became that herbal equivalent of the big red emergency button, right? You wake up, your throat feels a little funny, everybody at work sneezing, your kid comes home and says, everybody's sick in my class, and suddenly it's grab the Echinacea. Well, apparently it has morphed into people don't even need symptoms anymore to take this plant. And general rumors of illnesses, people go, oh, it's time. And here's what I find interesting. We just talked about astragalus, and that was a completely different conversation, right? Astragalus gave us the idea into incorporating herbs into our everyday life. We talked about putting it into stocks, letting those tougher roots simmer and build little intentional choices, right, in our soups. Echinacea has developed almost the opposite reputation, right? People tend to reach for it when they think something is about to happen. So today, I don't want to just give you another list of benefits. We've talked about this plant before. Instead, I want to answer a much more interesting question. Like, why did Echinacea become the herb that everybody grabs when they think they're going to get sick? And does that timing actually matter? Because this is where herbalism gets a whole lot more interesting than simply memorizing what herb goes with what symptom, right? So to kind of retouch on, since it's been a while, right? Remember, Echinacea is actually a genus, not just one plant, right? There's several species, but the ones you will most commonly encounter in herbal preparations are Echinacea purpurea and Ustigofolia and Padlita. I think that's how you pronounce those. Depending on the species and the herbal tradition you're following, you may see different parts used, right? So some use the roots, leaves, flowers. Sometimes essentially the whole aerial portion of the plant. So when somebody says, I take Echinacea, my herbalist brain immediately wants to know, well, which Echinacea? And what part? And how is it prepared? Because those details actually do matter, right? It kind of gives you the bigger picture, right? And we have to remember, right? Echinacea is native to North America, right? So long before it became a bottle of capsules sitting beside the vitamin C at the Walmart, right? Several indigenous peoples of the plains and surrounding regions used species of Echinacea in their traditional practices. And later, Echinacea became incredibly popular among the eclectic physicians of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And this herb has basically had more career changes than most people I know. And it goes from indigenous traditional use to becoming incredibly popular among this small group of practitioners. And then it largely disappeared, right, from mainstream American medicine, then becomes popular again and as a European herbal medicine, and then eventually comes back to America as one of the most recognized herbal supplements on the market. So Echinacea has basically left, rebranded itself, and came home, well, with a new marketing department. So it's almost as catch trendy as elderberry, right? You've got the capsules, the teas, the tinctures, the gummies. Like, everybody's all about the immune support stuff, right? Look everywhere. They put Echinacea in common cold products, which actually creates a problem, right? Because once an herb becomes really popular, right, its traditional use often gets reduced to one sentence. And Echinacea's sentence has become, take this for your immune system. Okay, but that's a little too simple, right? So we know these plants are complex and complicated, but we like to skinny them right down, right? So let's actually talk about why this plant earned that reputation, right? So Echinacea contains a number of interesting constituents, right? And so depending on the species, the plant, the part, or the preparation, you will hear about those different constituents. And you don't need to memorize each and every one for each species. What I want you to understand is that we're not dealing with one magical immune chemical, right? We're dealing with a complex plant containing multiple groups of constituents. And researchers have investigated how Echinacea preparations may interact with different aspects of the immune function and inflammatory signaling, right? And that's an important distinction, because I don't particularly love the phrases, Echinacea boosts your immune system. What does boost really mean? And we're actually going to talk about that in a later lesson. But are we turning it from a 7 to a 12? Like, what are we doing to the immune system here, right? The immune system is extraordinarily complicated. So more immune activity isn't automatically better, right? We want an immune response that's appropriate. And different Echinacea products aren't necessarily interchangeable either. Species matters. Plant part matters. Extraction matters. Dosage especially matters. And even research studies don't always use the exact same Echinacea product. And that's one reason you can find studies that seem to disagree with one another, right? They're not necessarily studying identical things, right? So now we get to the big question, right? You've probably heard, take Echinacea at the very first sign of an illness. Well, there's a reason that idea has stuck around, right? Echinacea has traditionally been thought of more of an herb used around acute situations than as simply something you would take every day forever, ever, and always. And modern clinical research on Echinacea for common colds really has mixed results. But some preparations and studies suggest modest potential benefits, right? While others don't show this real meaningful effect. So I'm not going to sit here and tell you, take Echinacea and you won't get sick. That's just not responsible herbalism. That's just not how plants work. But I also don't think the answer is Echinacea does absolutely nothing, right? The more accurate answer is that evidence depends heavily on the particular preparation being studied, and any benefit appears to be modest rather than miraculous. And frankly, that's kind of true about everything, right? So herbs are supportive, herbs are not superheroes, right? So let's compare astragalus versus Echinacea, right? This gives us a really interesting comparison with our last herb, right? Astragalus was our what am I doing while I'm well conversation, right? You're going to put it into your stocks, you're incorporating it into your food on a more steady basis. We're thinking about everyday nourishment and traditional tonic use. Well, Echinacea gives us something might be starting. What role could this herb potentially play? Those aren't competing, right? They're different tools. And that doesn't mean the first one failed, right? And that's one of the things I really want you to understand throughout the immune system, right? There isn't this best immune herb. The question doesn't really make sense, right? Best for what? Best for when Well, I mean, what are you thinking? Like, best for when? What? Preparation, person, right? Best circumstances. The better we understand our plants, the less appealing those top 5 immune herbs everyone needs lists become. Because herbalism has more nuances than that, really. I mean, it's actually quite complex. You can simplify it, but it's actually quite complex. So, in the talk of the plant parts, right? If you've grown echinacea, you probably recognize the gorgeous purple flowers, right? And it's very tempting to look at them and think, well, obviously that's what I use. Well, not necessarily. Roots are extremely important in echinacea herbalism, particularly with species such as Echinacea augustifolia, right? So you'll also find preparations made from the aerial portions of Echinacea purpurea, right? And that's what this one is back here. And that's why reading the label matters. Don't just look at the front where it says Echinacea immune support, right? Flip it over. What species, what plant part did they use? What's the preparation? Suddenly you're learning a whole lot more about what you're actually buying and using your money for, right? So if you know one is good for aerial portions and one's good for roots, and somebody's used the root on the one that's good for aerial portions or vice versa, well, you might want to pick a different one, right? So echinacea is also a really fun herb to experience when fresh. So if you've ever tasted a good fresh echinacea preparation and your mouth starts to feel a little tingly, maybe slightly numb, and you're thinking, oh my gosh, did I just make poison? No, you did not. That tingling sensation is a characteristic of certain echinacea preparations, particularly those rich in alkamides. So, herbalists sometimes use that sensation as one of the clues when assessing certain echinacea roots or tinctures, which is pretty cool because now you're not just reading about the plant, right? You're experiencing it. I actually have an echinacea plant that's about ready to be drained, or a tincture, so that way I'm about to try that for myself here pretty soon. So, can you make echinacea tea? Well, yes, you can. But preparation matters, right? As we're beginning to understand, a tincture can be particularly useful with echinacea because alcohol is good as extracting some of those constituents that you really want, like the alkamides, and they aren't really extracted efficiently with just plain water, right? Water, meanwhile, extracts other constituents, right? So again, you come back to something we've talked about throughout these series, right? The question isn't simply, is echinacea good? The question is, what preparation are we talking about, right? And if it's not going to pull what you need, then maybe you should switch to the other, right? So that's why 2 products with the same herb written across the front can actually be 2 very different products. That's why sometimes you can say, oh, this worked great, but now it's not working. Well, maybe they switched up their formula, right? So here's another thing you'll hear, right? Echinacea should only be taken for 10 days. Then you'll hear somebody else say, nah, that's an old myth. And somebody else says, well, you should cycle it, right? You should take it for a certain period and then come off. Well, welcome to Herbalism, where there's 95,000 different opinions, and we're all still trying to figure out which ones are truth. So there isn't good evidence supporting a universal rule that every person must stop echinacea after exactly a certain number of days. But historically and clinically, however, it's often been used around acute seasonal needs rather than automatically becoming a year-round herb for everybody, right? That's the distinction that I care more about, not some arbitrary countdown number, right? But why are you taking it? Does it still make sense for what you're trying to accomplish, right? If you're not getting better, and it's been 10 days, you probably should definitely switch up your formulas, right? So now again, for the fun part, right? For safety, echinacea is generally well tolerated by many adults when appropriately used. but it doesn't mean that it's appropriate for everybody. People can have allergic reactions, particularly if they're sensitive to plants in the daisy family, which includes plants such as ragweed, chrysanthemums, marigolds, and daisies. So if you have an autoimmune condition, take autoimmune suppressive medication, have significant allergies, pregnant, breastfeeding, or taking medications that could interact with herbal products, please have a conversation with your medical provider before you just automatically assume because it's natural, you'll be okay taking it. And that is going to always be my theme, right? Natural doesn't universally mean safer or appropriate. There's some very natural things out there that can really hurt you, right? Venomous snakes, natural, don't want to bring them home. So let's come back to where we started, right? So somebody sneezes, do we smash the emergency echinacea button, right? Maybe we don't need to panic quite as much. I know none of us really have time to get sick, but echinacea does give us an important lesson about timing, right? Not every immune herb has the same job. Not every herb needs to be taken every day. And not every herb needs to wait until you're completely miserable either to take it, right? Sometimes herbalism is about recognizing the different role plants have traditionally played and understanding that modern evidence can and cannot, what it can and cannot tell us about it, right? Astragalus taught us to plan. Echinacea will teach you to pay attention. And I think both lessons belong in that immunosupport lifestyle. That's why I kind of brought Echinacea back for this one and expanded on it a little bit more from the first video, because you will hear it everywhere. But if there's one thing I want you to remember from today's video, Echinacea isn't the magical emergency button, right? It's a fascinating North American plant with a long traditional history, complicated chemistry, and different species, different plant parts, different preparations, and a much more nuanced story than your supplement aisle at your grocery store would like to tell you. And honestly, that's why you study the herbs individually. Because once you get past the marketing campaigns, the plant is always more interesting, right? So we're going to shift gears in the next videos, and we're going to go to a different kingdom. So we're not going to be playing with roots. We're not going to be playing with flowers. We're not playing with berries. We're going to talk about mushrooms. And I know a lot of you guys have been waiting for the mushrooms. So we're going to start with the different, different mushrooms, right? Try to figure out why these slimy little bobs can actually have a medicinal effect on you, right? So until next time, guys, stay rooted, stay curious, and as always, keep growing in grace.